This is Community Forum, a community service of cantv. I'm your host, Juan Carlos Hernandez. Since 1989, Community Media Workshop has looked to diversify the voices in news and public debates. They provide a mix of coaching for community groups and sourcing for journalists. Our guests today are Susy Schultz, the new Executive Director of the Community Media Workshop, and Thom Clark, the founder and former Executive Director. Welcome.
Thank you for having us, Juan.
Thank you.
Let's start off by talking about what the Community Media Workshop is and how it started and why. Thom?
Back in 1989, the co-founder of the workshop, Hank DeZutter, a former journalist, engaged me to help him train MacArthur grantees. They had figured in the Tribune series that was questioning the development and future of the city. It was when we were in a political vacuum between the death of Harold Washington and the ascension of Richard Daley as mayor. And MacArthur was upset that they were some of their grantees were not ending up in the media very effectively. In fact, they were cast in a very negative light. So we began training groups on what journalists need, how to better position their stories, in fact, how to become better storytellers. And over time, what I thought was going to be a part-time project grew into a full-time program of year-round training programs, an annual conference, a media guide that people have really come to count on, and a lot of work behind the scenes with journalists who we regularly engage to introduce them to unofficial sources, to neighborhood leaders that weren't paid to talk to the media like many corporate spokespersons or even politicians are, and to make sure that that third and fourth source got into regular news coverage in this town.
Okay, great. Well, you're new on the job, but how did you come to Community Media Workshop?
Well, I've been a storyteller. I've been a journalist for a while, and I was one of the reporters that when Thom called during the trainings, where he would be training all of these community voices, I was asked to cover. Did a big series on Harold Washington and his presidency, and I was asked to cover social service issues in the neighborhoods. But at that time, we didn't have. We really weren't allowed to go out into the neighborhoods. We didn't have any time. We were filing so many different stories. So whenever Thom called and said, at the end of his trainings, he puts people in front of media so that they know exactly how to tell their stories. And he also has them listen to media saying, this is what we prefer as individuals, this is how you contact me, etc. And Thom would call, I would be one of the panelists, because I knew I would walk in and I would meet, 20, 25 people engaged in their communities who cared about issues. I would usually walk out with stories that I could do that day, and stories that I knew that were important to the city of Chicago, because they talked about issues, they talked about people, and they highlighted people who cared about all these things. So it was definitely, for me, exactly what Thom set out to do. It was a journalist being able to hear those other voices.
And that slowly you just started, you kept your contact with the organization?
Yeah, I think anybody who's met Thom has kept contact with him because they understand that he's an amazing resource for journalists here in the city. We often are thought of, when you talk about the Community Media Workshop, people don't necessarily know the name, but they do know the Terkel Awards, because that represents quality journalism. You have that event coming up March 6th, where we've honored 70 quality journalists who tell those stories and tell them with good journalism out in the community. So they know that about us, and they don't necessarily know how much we're engaged with journalists, because journalists know if they need something, if they need some training on issues, if they need ethnic media and community media also know if they need connecting up. We have projects that will help them, that will teach and engage them, just as we teach and engage nonprofits throughout the neighborhoods.
So it's, for journalists, in essence, it's constant professional development that you offer.
Correct. That's right. That's a great way.
It's a great way to look at it. And in this shifting media landscape, which has really changed the playing field tremendously the last 5 or 10 years, I think we've kept up with the technology and the additional platforms that are available. There are fewer journalists at legacy or media outlets that are covering these kind of stories. In some respects, they need our help even more. But with the onslaught of bloggers and citizen journalists and more hyper-local news sites, finding who can tell your story in the media landscape is increasingly a bigger challenge, although that some of those very tools that we're now teaching people to use, like Twitter and Facebook, are other ways to find what journalists might be interested in, so you can begin to position your organization's story that way.
Okay, and so those early days, you went out into the community and started engaging people from these organizations, or how did that happen?
Well, beginning with MacArthur grantees and then spreading to really any nonprofits, we actually started at Malcolm X College on the west side, so we were kind of out in the neighborhood when we started. We later affiliated with Columbia College, and the way Chicago's transportation grid is set up, a lot of our trainings do take place downtown, but we try to often go out and about. I've just been working with a cohort of 10 grantees of one of our longtime supporters, the Alphawood Foundation, where I've been able to do a deeper dive into some of their work. And that involved a lot of site visits and going out really around the region. I've been not just in the city, but all around the region. And that keeps us fresh in terms of our contacts and sources, but also as a practical matter, meeting on their turf has allowed them to, I think, get a little bit more out of the capacity building work that we're trying to do with them.
So in these workshops, how do they look? Let's say I'm a person that is part of this organization. I want to build my skills. I want to go through one of these. What happens there?
We offer a pretty interactive 3-hour half-day workshop is kind of our typical format. I'm going to let Susy talk about one she did yesterday that I think was a pretty interesting example of the kind of work that we are moving into as we customize kind of our standard training sets. Basic communications plan, spokesperson training. We offer more and more things around social media. We have upcoming trainings on how to make better use of your Facebook page. But even with all the changes in the technology and the platforms, at the core is teaching groups how to move beyond brochure language and proposalese into better storytelling.
That's a good way to put it.
I think this is the biggest challenge that nonprofits have, because we come up with good mission statements and 5-point plans to save the world, and we have a certain funderese that we use. But
I never heard those terms, but I know exactly what you're talking about.
I think this is what we need to break out of, because we have naturally good stories to tell about the work we're doing. And I think that's why, bringing someone the caliber of Susy's background experience as a journalist as well as a public information officer was kind of a perfect fit for what we're trying to do. You want to talk about working with the Health Consortium?
It was, I was in Dalton yesterday at the Illinois Health Consortium.
That's down south, right?
It's down, yes, and the group of people who work there who have wonderful programs, who reach out to children, who reach out to the elderly, all with health concerns. They were gathered there, and they work not only in the south suburbs, but also in the southland part of the city. So, and they are, when you look at these people, what's amazing, and this is why I love this work, is here are people who are touching other people's lives, and they are really virtually saving lives. But because of the nature of the work that everybody does, and because of the economy, and because of the fact that it's a nonprofit, you spend a lot more time worrying about, are the doors going to be open? What is the process we have to go through for this? And indulging in really that jargon. And jargon, we like to talk about jargon as being a shorthand within your industry to help you get your job done. But it can then also be a roadblock for other people to understand your work.
Right.
So here we were talking to, again, these great people who touch so many people's lives, but they were having trouble. We were teaching them how to get out of their own jargon. And finally we got to a couple of instances where we were like, this one program they're starting, it allows seniors to stay in their homes instead of going into assisted living. And it's a wonderful program, but the language they were using in the beginning of the forum was more, this is a collaborative to move forward with a collective. And you couldn't understand, you couldn't see the people.
Right,
So
right.
what we do, which I think is important, and we have a depth at what we do, and we have the unique vantage point as well of having our media connections work and training there. But what we do is we remind people that very often at nonprofits, what you're doing is you're covering issues, and those issues affect people. So remember those people and paint the picture of those people when you tell your story, because that's what your work does.
All right, definitely. And that in my own experience with the nonprofit world here in the city, it has been about that work with the people and what they do. And it also brings to mind, and you work with local organizations, but a lot of what I saw in my own work with nonprofits is these global connections. especially like, well, from my own experience in the Latino community, connections to family, to problems, to issues, not just here, but abroad, 2,000 miles away or more.
Yeah.
And how does that come into play into the work you do?
Well, we've been part of national networks over the years. That is both for, quite frankly, my ongoing professional development and to keep current on breaking issues or movements that we're beginning to come into play. We were very early involved with immigration reform on a couple of different levels. We actually did a lot of the backroom boilerplate work with the original March 10th coalition that led to the May Day Human Rights Parade, I wanted to try to call it, in 2006, where we beat LA with the turnout.
Right.
Well, some of that beating LA was, quite frankly, the messaging we were doing in the back room. We trained some of the community leaders who were involved with that march. We helped them with their press releases, but we were also monitoring hour by hour the turnout and where people were at, and trying to feed that into including police scanners, and feed that into the media outlets, and particular reporters we knew were covering that story. There was a very different flavor to how that immigration march got covered that day in 2006 than I think would have normally been the case, except for the prep work that we did with both leaders, the kind of myriad of groups that came together in that coalition.
Right.
We're seen as kind of a hub or neutral ground where groups, even if they're not quite agreeing with each other, they can come to us for advice and counsel about how to better message, what technology to use, what platforms to use. So I see Chicago as, our work with ethnic and community media is located in a website called Chicago's the World, because we are very close to the roots that make up this city, which is in many cases just 2 or 3 generations removed from a homeland country that wasn't here.
Right.
And that, to my mind, is part of the rich narrative that this city has to deliver to the media and to the public and the audience that monitor and follow and read the media.
And I think Thom sometimes glosses over the effect that he's had with his work. When he says that the Community Media Workshop is a hub, it really is. I mean, government comes to us, neighborhoods come to us, journalists come to us, all sorts of people dealing with issues. And the Community Media Workshop has also taken the lead in ensuring at big events, the Democratic Convention, when the whole world came here to elect Bill Clinton as the Democratic nominee when he was president, Thom had a whole project making sure that these world journalists understood what the city was all about, and tying Chicago to the world. Did the same thing with NATO during that, when at a point when people were a little bit nervous. I think people who are in power very often get nervous about controlling things and controlling the message.
Right.
But putting themselves in Thom's hand, and as well as also the story, allowing the story to unfold, what happened was this wonderful picture of a world-class city came out, not just the center of the city, but the whole city, how it was rich in, yes, problems, but rich in also people coming to the table to solve those problems. And that's the side of the city that we also bring out.
That's right, and that, but it also makes me think, don't you get questioned for helping these groups? Aren't we as journalists supposed to be, well, I don't even know if we can be objective, but I guess that's, I think, that one of the parameters that's placed on journalists, that like, you need to be objective, you need to tell every side of the story, you need to look at this, you just can't take one side and work with the community. What about the other people? How do you respond to that type of question?
As someone who taught journalism in the graduate program at Columbia, like Susy now does, I made it very clear in the first class my issues with journalistic objectivity. I have a lot of objections around it. What we would try to teach is being fair and balanced. It's not good enough to quote the mayor.
Sounds like Fox News.
Well, they co-opted that phrase, and it's not fair. Yeah.
It's not good enough to quote the mayor and an alderman. What about the people whose mayoral announcement will impact? And yes, sometimes journalists don't have time on deadline to find that third or fourth source, but we try to make it hard for them to use as an excuse by continuing to feed a ready resource of news sources who know about the issue, have a response to what the mayor may have announced today or yesterday, and they need to be included in that story. At its core, going back to an earlier question, I think our work tries to enrich our democracy. Without having every voice in the public square, it's a bunch of powerful folks on the top who are making all the decisions. Now we know that's the reality some days of the week, but other days of the week, as we see being played out on the world stage now with Ukraine and other things that are going on, when you don't engage the community's going to rise up and react to stuff that's happening. In the middle of all that, I think, is a media landscape that is actually a very interesting time for journalism, as well as for organizations that are trying to more effectively tell their story. And do you want to address the objectivity issue?
Well, I don't believe that any journalist can be objective.
Right.
We all have our own opinions. We all have our own ideas. But I think you can put those aside and you can be fair. It's sad that to say fair and balanced is a reference to a station that isn't fair and balanced necessarily on the national level, although on the local level they produce some amazing reporting. But I think that you can only come to the table, and I teach advanced reporting at Columbia College Chicago in the undergraduate program, and I tell my students who cover neighborhoods that what you have to do is you really have to tell both sides of the story, and that's what we're doing. We're not advocating a position. We are not saying take this position. We are saying here are sources who will tell you this. And we're basically telling journalists you need to tell the full story. And we're going to help you tell the full story by pointing you to people who actually can speak about the issue, who know, and in some ways, we give the journalists a level of confidence that they're going to be able to talk to somebody who can speak to what they're covering, who can, because there's
with authority,
with a certain amount of authority that they've done work on issues, etc. So there's we're helping them find sources that we know are out there, and we are saving them time so that their stories can be richer.
That definitely agreed. Now, Thom, you've not only been involved with the workshop, you've also been part of the work here at CanTV. Tell us about that.
Well, the leadership of cantv has always tried to engage the workshop in this public access station's work. Our news tip service has run on the text channel here for years. For about 8 years, I hosted my own show here, and I always saw it as kind of an extension of our spokesperson training work. I was often bringing community leaders who had never been in front of a camera before, except maybe in our classroom, to really have their first experience in talking about an issue or a story important to their work in the neighborhood. And I came to realize that there was a pretty committed audience out there that is not normally that accessible through mainstream or legacy media like the Tribune or even WGN. That's not to knock those mainstream outlets, but there's an audience not being served as well as this station does, and with your many different platforms that you still offer. And that was a real learning experience for me, is to run into people on the street who had seen the Saturday night Community Media and You program of the previous week and would engage me in a discussion about, when are you going to talk about that issue again? I know somebody else who can speak to that issue. So I think there's a real community dialogue going on through the resource that CanTV represents, and it was a real joy to be part of that package for a while.
And I think the CanTV's work shows as well how important it is for the audience to see themselves on whatever the platform is. And that again speaks to when people again talk to us about, is there bias in your work, et cetera, et cetera.
Right.
Really, if there's a bias, it's that we want the media to survive. And we know darn well that if the legacy media, if the bigger guns don't reflect the voices in the community, I mean, if you eliminate women and people of color in the city of Chicago, who's your audience?
Right.
So so by helping getting those voices in those platforms, we're really helping them survive. That's part of what we see as a part of our mission, if that makes sense.
No, it sure does. And part of that survival involves bringing out stories and issues that are underreported. When you first started, after the first few years, what were some of the underreported stories that came to light or that you helped bring to light, Thom?
Well, there are three that immediately come to mind. One of the first campaigns we worked on was a combination of a documentary maker, quite frankly, and a legal aid attorney who was helping the Henry Horner Mothers Guild on the West Side. And to make a long story short, the interfaith pastors organization, I don't have that name quite correct, they were one of these groups that was cited in the Tribune story as holding up the development of the city. Within 6 months after that Tribune story appeared, those pastors and other organizers in the West Side had negotiated a new deal with the owners of the Blackhawks and the Bulls to redevelop Chicago Stadium and the surrounding neighborhood. Pre-CHA transformation plan, high-rises that were known as the Henry Horner high-rises were torn down and converted into low-rise 2 flats with granny apartments upstairs, a new Boys and Girls Club, a new library. These were community benefits the community negotiated with those sports teams with a very different kind of development. And we played a significant role behind the scene in helping to train the Henry Horner Mothers Guild leadership, the legal aid attorney who was a very good attorney but had trouble coming up with his own sound bites. It made national news.
Right.
And it was really interesting to see how messaging that we helped them develop came through that reporter's mouth after it had been through several other places and press conferences and whatnot. We also worked early on community policing. The current education writer reporter for WBEZ was an organizer, newsletter writer at the time, Linda Lutton. We kind of plucked her out of that, helped her with the newsletter. She became a freelancer for the Reader, won one of our early Terkel Awards, and is now doing award-winning work, particularly with Alice Kolowitz on their Harper High series that appeared last year. It's neat to look back and see where Linda started. In fact, she met Alex at a Terkel Awards ceremony about 10 years ago, and that resulted in a collaboration that has led to really good journalism that won Peabody Awards and national attention. So we seem to have had a knack over the years to be slightly ahead of the curve, anticipating issues that before they had become mainstream news. And when we've been able to do that, we've been able to make sure that those community voices were very much a part of that story.
And we're running out of time, and I apologize for having to just cut some questions a little short because I would like to get more into that. But tell me about the Terkel Awards and how that started and the event that's coming up, please.
Studs Terkel kind of became a mentor for the Community Media Workshop. Hank DeZutter, the co-founder, and he were old friends. Hank was actually a couple of his books. As I got to know him, I also became an acknowledgement name in a couple of his books.
I think you're going to have to explain exactly for some people who Studs Terkel is.
Studs Terkel was a legendary radio interviewer. I grew up listening to him, and he later converted a lot of that style of interviews to oral histories, where he really brought the voices of ordinary as well as extraordinary people. He interviewed the rich and famous as well as welfare workers and other ordinary folks. And Division Street America was kind of the first book that used this particular form, and going through race and the Good War and many other tomes since, he really brought a variety of voices to public attention. And so his work very much mirrored what Hank and I tried to do in the early days to bring underrepresented voices into mainstream news coverage. And when we realized that we needed, as most nonprofits do, to have our annual benefit, what were we going to do that was going to be different? And we realized this was our chance to find and cite journalists who, in the Terkelian tradition, were bringing underrepresented voices into their reporting. And over the years, we've now honored over 70 journalists, mostly from the Chicagoland area, culminating in our 25th anniversary during March, where we will again honor Kartemkin Films, Alejandro Escalona, who was a columnist for the Sun-Times and now works for Telemundo, and Steve Bulgara, who's been at the Chicago Reader for years and years. They happen to be our journalists who are being honored this year, but it really is a celebration of getting real people into the news, and our mentor Studs, who passed away about 5 years ago, is still very much in that room, thanks to both videotape and just his spirit that really flows through the whole event.
And can I say that for those people wondering whether they should come, they have to come, because we're also going to be celebrating Thom this year. We're going to be celebrating Thom's 25 years, what he built, his legacy, what he founded, the work. He's touched so many people. So we're celebrating great journalism as well as a great man.
Okay, is he eligible for a Terkel Award?
I believe he's already gotten one.
The board gave me a Terkel at our 20th anniversary, and
Okay.
as they did the co-founder when he retired in 2000.
What about a Lifetime Achievement Award?
Well, that's not on the docket, but I think I think he, in the great journalism tradition of raising a toast to a colleague, understands that that's a great celebration as well. And we're all about meeting people, and bringing people together. So we want more people to join us, so we can talk about the great stuff that he's done. He's a fun guy too, so it'll be a fun night.
And when is the date again for this?
March 6th
March
at Columbia College's Film Row Cinema.
Okay, great. Thanks so much for coming out and sharing just a bit of all the great work you're doing.
Well, Carlos, good luck in your work too.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Community Forum is a community service of CanTV. If your nonprofit would like to work with CanTV, call 312-738-1400 and ask for nonprofit services. Tune into Community Forum for local issues and concerns every Saturday at 7:30 p.m. on CanTV 21. I'm Juan Carlos Hernandez. Thank you for joining us.